Good morning. So this intro is going to be a little weird. So one of the great kind of advances, if you will, that has happened during the pandemic in the church is we get to bring in speakers like me to use SoundView right where you are over video. We also, as local congregations, utilize video for when we need to kind of practice a little more safety, be more mindful of the vulnerable people in our community. Even in this time where a lot of us are vaccinated, lots of us are still meeting in a hybrid format, both online and in person. So this intro to today's message is going to be a little different because I get to take peak advantage of our ability to use video by preaching this message to two congregations. So good morning, SoundView. I'm so glad to be back here for another week talking with you about peacemaking and what does it look like to be peacemakers in our everyday lives. And hello, Roots. Roots Covenant is the church that my husband and I pastor together. Love you, misfits. And we are continuing our conversation on looking at the Bible with grown-up eyes. Our series is called Campfire. And I'm sure you're wondering why you're watching this. Okay, why is Osheta preaching the same message to two congregations? Because sometimes the Holy Spirit be crafty like that, and one message feels like it can speak to both congregations in different ways. And so as I was working on my initial message for you, SoundView, a continuation on our conversation on Shalom, I realized that a lot of the things I was saying to you were things that I also wanted to share with my family, my church family, Roots, about Shalom and Shalom in action, through a story that I have learned to look at with a new set of eyes, with grown-up eyes. So SoundView, meet Roots. Roots, meet SoundView. We're just going to hold this digital space to be all one community of people who love Jesus and are seeking to be peacemakers right where we are. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Campfire series, SoundView, just so you can kind of understand where we've been. So the Campfire series that Roots has been working through is looking at stories that we learned as children with adult eyes. So we are asking ourselves, how were we first introduced to these stories? And acknowledging that there might be some problematic aspects to the story that we never really allowed ourselves to explore as younger believers, maybe even children, that maybe it felt inappropriate at that age to explore. But now as we are grown up and we are reading these stories, we still want to look at these stories and hold them close to us. We want to cherish what we can learn from these stories about who God is and who we are to God and what does it look like to be ambassadors of God's kingdom right where we are. And so we want to love scripture, but we want to be able to ask hard questions and acknowledge problematic aspects of it. So that's what Campfire has been all about. And as I was working on your sermon, SoundView, for this Sunday, I realized that I kept thinking about two women in the Bible whose story was first introduced to me in one way, and that as I grew up, and as I became a woman myself, as I became a woman devoted to Jesus and wanting to be a peacemaker, like I talked about last week, looking at the Hebraic concept of shalom, rethinking about peacemaking, or reframing, that's a better way of putting it, reframing my peacemaking through the Hebraic concept of shalom, I realized that these two women were some of my favorite shalom-seeking peacemakers. So we are going to look at the story of Ruth and Naomi with adult eyes. We're going to look at the story of Ruth and Naomi through the lens of Shalom. And we are going to look for the ways that they were peacemakers in their everyday lives. So let's go ahead and look at the passage so that we can rock and roll together. All right, I'm excited. So we are in Ruth, chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. Let's go. So it says, and it'll be on the screen in front of you. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you say, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So, the first time I heard about this story in Ruth, Ruth is a very short book of the Bible. It's just 4 chapters. You could probably read it a couple of times in 1 week for reflection. But the first time I heard about this particular interaction was in a devotion time. I was about 12 years old. And I was a part of an Assembly of God church. And one of the ministries of our church was door-to-door evangelism. So we would go out in our neighborhoods, the surrounding neighborhoods to our church. We would knock on doors, and we would say, "Hey, we want to share with you the gospel of Jesus Christ." And as a 12-year-old, at that point, I had been a Christian for about 6 years. I loved Jesus, and I felt like everybody should know who Jesus was. And so I joined this team. I was the youngest person on this team. And before the team goes out on a Saturday morning, one of the elders in our church would sit down and do a devotion to send us out so that we would have something just in our hearts to share when we talk to people. And the elder got up and he shared this story. And then he goes on to talk about how Elimelech was a man from Bethlehem, and he gathered up his wives and his sons to leave a famine to take refuge in the godless, sinful country of Moab. Just for a little bit of context, Moab was a neighboring kingdom just located right across the River Jordan in ancient Israel. And then this elder goes on to say things went from bad to worse for Elimelech because he left God's country and he went to the sinless country because then his sons married Moabite women. And that's just really bad. And so for a little bit of context, he told us about how the Moabite women were negative and dangerous women because they were the ones who caused the Israelites to worship Baal. And so then he went on to talk about how, Elimelech and his family displeased God because they intermarried with the Moabites. And that there are texts in the Bible that forbade intermarriage. So we were not encouraged to have intimate relationships with anybody who did not worship the true and living God. And so we have to go out into the streets and we have to invite people in to become Christians because they need to know the living God and we want them to be our families. But until they become our families, we have to be skeptical of them. We have to be afraid of them and we have to keep our guard up. We were told to guard our hearts. We were told to go out in the world, but be not of the world. It was a warning to not leave God's protection and intermingle with sinners, to be suspicious and even contemptuous of people who believed differently about God and expressed their faith differently than we did. Now, this was weird for me as a 12-year-old because I loved Jesus and I wanted to love others who didn't know Jesus because my 12-year-old mind thought if you love someone, you want to communicate all the good things about them so that somebody else might be interested in loving them too. Well, this was not the strategy that was taught to me that morning. So we go out in the streets and I'm just as this young, on fire, if you will, Christian who wants to share the gospel, who wants to introduce people to Jesus. That was the first time I had to wrestle with the idea of maybe being unloving to somebody who doesn't love Jesus is the most loving thing you could do. Love the sinner, but hate the sin. That was the first time I was introduced to Naomi and Ruth as a cautionary tale of loving the sinner. And that didn't sit right with me. And as I began to do more work with my faith and understand who Jesus was, I got rid of that view of Naomi and Ruth. But then, as a 17, 18-year-old, who had kissed dating goodbye and was waiting for the one that God had set apart for me, I started to be introduced to another aspect of this story. The Ruth and Boaz of it all. The swelling rom-com of it all. The hey girl hey in the fields of it all. See, I was then introduced to Ruth and Naomi's story, not as Ruth and Naomi's stories, but Ruth and Boaz's story. This was just a preamble, just giving us some context. Just like once upon a time there were these three women, and then this man came along. And so I was introduced again to this story from another angle, one that rooted the beauty of Ruth, the book of Ruth, in the love relationship, the romance of Ruth and Boaz. I saw an article in National Geographic that says how Ruth's selflessness won Boaz's heart. There are tons of Bible studies for couples and singles about Boaz and Ruth. And I have been to more than I would like a few too many weddings where Ruth's beautiful vow at the end of the passage I just read to Naomi was used as vows from groom to bride and bride to groom. As a single Christian, this felt incredibly problematic for me. Does Ruth seem to teach that only God's love can be manifested in a romantic heterosexual relationship with clear power dynamics? See, as I came to this passage, these were the two problematic aspects of it that really made it difficult for me to find Jesus and find connection in it. So what I would love to do with the rest of our time is to look at this passage through the lens of Shalom. If you remember, I teach Shalom as God's dream for the world as it should be, nothing broken, nothing missing, everything made whole. What if, as we read this passage, this interaction between Ruth and Naomi, we keep Brueggemann's definition of Shalom in mind? That Shalom is a persistent vision of joy, well-being, harmony, and prosperity. A vision with many dimensions and subtle nuances: love, loyalty, grace, salvation, justice, blessing, righteousness. Shalom is the freight of a dream of God that resists all tendencies to division, hostility, fear, drivenness, and misery. What if we didn't limit God's dream to just salvation or worship practices? But what if we imagined that God's love extended past conventional and sensationalized relationships into a relationship between two women who loved each other dearly and reflected the love of God in the ways that they engaged with each other? What if the true love story of Ruth is between Ruth and Naomi? When I read Naomi, it's a little bit, when I read Ruth, it's a little bit like that scene in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, where the crew goes to the Quidditch World Cup and they stay in Perkins' charmed tent.
Home sweet home.
What?
Excellent, excellent. Girls, choose a bunk and unpack. Ron, get out of the kitchen. We're all hungry.
Yeah, get out of the kitchen, Ron.
Feet off the table.
Feet off the table. I love magic.
You know, I come to Ruth and it just seems like a very simple story about some women in this very ordinary context. And something, and it kind of is like a hinge book. You know, we read it and we find out that because of Ruth and Boaz's relationship, that the lineage that Jesus is a part of that lineage, that Ruth and Boaz are a part of Jesus' lineage. And it does point us to Jesus, which that's how I read the Bible, as a story that points to Jesus and a story that brings us to an understanding of who Jesus is, his ministry, his life, his mission, so that we can follow the Jesus way right where we are. So I often come to it and it looks very simple, but we're going to look at it through the lens of Shalom. And as we look at it, it's going to look like the picture on the other side of the screen. We're going to go into the tent that looks very simple, and we are going to see that it is completely different. That Shalom, God's dream for the world as it should be, the vision of flourishing and wholeness, makes things lush and colorful and protective. Like in the tent, you go in and there's a kitchen that's stocked with great food, and there's community and care. Oftentimes when we come to these stories that we are so used to, it looks like that very nondescript tent. But if we look at it through the lens of Shalom, everything changes. So I want to lay a little bit of groundwork. See, it's important for us to know this. Like last week I talked about, my struggles with thinking that peacemakers were these people on pedestals. Well, I think it's important for us to know that Ruth and Naomi and Orpah and Boaz are just everyday people. The story of Ruth is described as a description of these very regular people and their lives and their interactions. And this is important because it follows right after the book of Judges. The Judges were heroic. They were leaders with wisdom. They had talent and acumen. They listened to God and spoke on behalf of God. These are people who naturally are comfortable on a pedestal, but Ruth is a story of ordinary people, a hungry family fleeing, two Moabite women who marry two Moabite women who marry that family's Israelite sons. And how this family has this attempt to become an intercultural family. There's a story of three men who die in unknown ways. But given their ages and the utter chaos that their death brings, it seems to me that there's some trauma there. Illness or violence, possibly. We see three women who love each other dearly, but are subjected to a patriarchal society where they know a future together is improbable. Three Israelite men would be willing to take them all on together and stay in Moab? Not very many. So we see in this passage that we start out with everyday, ordinary people who end up doing something extraordinary. And it's not extraordinary things that we imagine, like being heroic or getting up and speaking or leading groups of people. But these people in this book, these two women particularly, Ruth and Naomi, do something incredibly heroic, incredibly extraordinary. These women reflect Hesed. Hesed is a central theological term in the Old Testament. It's the key attribute in the Lord's description in Exodus 3, 4, 6 through 7. And it's an obligation that's placed on all of his people in Micah 6, 8. There's no English equivalent to it, so it's been pretty hard to prove or have Bible translators, render it accurately. But in many versions, it would appear as kindness, faithfulness, mercy, goodness, loyalty, and steadfast love. So the story is set up that these are ordinary people going through extraordinary heartbreak. And so it starts with these people, reckoning with this. Then Naomi gets some information. It says that Naomi heard that the Lord was caring for his people, so she gathered her daughters-in-law together with them. And she says to them, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me." That is the very first key of the extraordinary thing we should be looking for in this passage. Not somebody cutting the head off of a giant, or not somebody, standing up and proclaiming and singing this beautiful song, but someone who has chosen Hesed, steadfast love, loving kindness. Naomi set the tone for her daughters-in-law, that her wish for them is to flourish, to thrive, to find life and love, even if that means she'll have to suffer. And I totally get when some read through Ruth, they see Hesed and Boaz becoming Ruth's hero by eventually marrying her and saving her and Naomi from ruin by becoming what was known at that time as a kinsman redeemer. But I think the first paragraphs of Ruth, the storyteller is asking us to pay attention here. The ordinary, everyday woman with incredible suffering is the first practitioner of Shalom because she chooses Hesed. She chooses a steadfast love for her daughters. So, if Shalom is the charmed tent, fully decorated and cozy, Hesed is the smell of the stew cooking in the kitchen, the soft blankets on the cot for every camper, the soft crackling of the fire. It's the texture of Shalom. Hesed is Shalom in action. We are invited into this. We are told in Psalm 107:43, in the Passion Translation, "If you are truly wise, you'll learn from what I've told you. It's time for you to consider these profound lessons of God's great love and mercy." That moving through the world as a wise disciple of Jesus means we move through the world looking for God's love and mercy and prepared to reflect God's love and mercy, that we consider it in all of our interactions with each other. And that is what peacemaking is. Peacemaking is this moving through the world, looking for God's love and extending God's mercy. Peacemaking is choosing hesed, steadfast, loving kindness. Hesed is God's loyal love, shalom seeking peacemaking in practice. There are three things I want us to look at as we are looking at hesed and considering how to be peacemakers who choose hesed, who choose steadfast, loving kindness. So the first thing that we see is that these women had a proximity to each other's pain. It says, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. These were 3 women who had experienced untold suffering. And these are 3 women who were trying to figure out how to thrive in a system that was set up for their failure. They are women. They could not provide for themselves apart from being married to a man who could provide for them and who could not only provide physically for them, but provide legacy and lineage for them. These were women who were at the mercy of the men in their lives. They had a proximity to each other's pain. They stepped into each other's pain. They shared each other's pain. Hesed only happens when we are remarkably, unequivocally humanized. When we see each other's pain and we get close to each other's pain. Because humanizing each other leads to empathy. And empathy is the on-ramp to love. Peacemakers are simply people who love others well. We rehumanize those who have been dehumanized by the force of our love for them, by our commitment to hesed for them. I love what Brian Stevenson says about this idea of proximity to pain. He says in Just Mercy, there's a strength, a power even, in understanding brokenness, because embracing our brokenness creates a need, a desire for mercy, and perhaps a corresponding need to show mercy. When you experience mercy, you learn things that are hard to learn otherwise. You see things you can't otherwise see. You hear things you can't otherwise hear. You begin to recognize the humanity that resides in each of us. So the first step into being an everyday peacemaker like Naomi and Ruth is to be proximate to pain. The next is a practical care of felt need. So let's go on in the passage. It says, but Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Now, I'm not going to talk about that last part, the bitter, because I think that when I read that, I am actually looking at somebody who is being honest about their frustration and their heartache with God, but still choosing hesed, still choosing to love others. But what I love about this passage, while it may seem that she is pushing them away, like that scene in Harry and the Hendersons where they're throwing rocks at Harry to make him go back into the woods, she is actually speaking to them very practically. She is saying, I see your suffering, and here is the very best thing that I can offer you. Sometimes peacemaking is incredibly practical. We look at someone and we say, you are hungry, so let me feed you. You are lonely, so come, let's go for a walk together. Let me call you. Let me check up on you. You are in a dark space. You need encouragement. You need mental health support. Let's dream about how we can afford therapy for you. Are you taking your meds? How can I help you remember to take your meds? Sometimes we have to just look at the situation that's in front of us and bring the most practical response. I know that this is hard for us because we've over-spiritualized peacemaking. We think that peacemaking is just sitting and praying and being super still, but sometimes peacemaking is showing up in practical, tangible ways. The last thing that we see about how these two ordinary, everyday peacemakers embrace Hesed and seek Shalom is that they persevere for the long haul. But Ruth replied, do not urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Peacemaking is not a one and done thing. It's not something that's a checklist. While we can practically practice peace, it doesn't always make sense because it requires us to stay present and stay vulnerable and stay open for the long haul. See, Naomi had been a practitioner of Shalom. She chose Hesed for her two daughters-in-law. And then Ruth said, oh, you've set the tone. This is what our relationship is. I'm going to offer you Hesed. I'm going to offer you a steadfastness that says, I will not leave you. I will stay in this with you. I will continue to share in your suffering. I will continue to share in your joys. I will stay curious about your culture and your ways. I will be with you until your dying breath. You will never be alone. And when I think about what I love most about Jesus, is that even on the cross, Jesus turned to a thief who was in anguish and said, you are not alone. And when you die, you will not be alone. You will be in eternity with me. You will be in paradise with me. Peacemakers, part of our calling is to choose peacemaking today and choose it tomorrow and choose it the next day and choose it 5 years from now or 5 months from now or whatever. Every single opportunity we choose Shalom. We choose to see what's broken and ask God, how can I be a part of binding it up? What practical thing can I bring? And when things don't go the way I want them to, when things get hard, when I feel confused, I'm going to stick at it. Because Shalom endures. Because Shalom, God's dream for the world as it should be, nothing broken, nothing missing, everything made whole, can only happen when we are brave enough to choose Hesed and be steadfast. I love this thought from Carolyn Custis James in her book, The Gospel of Ruth. So she says, God's idea of a partnership places enormous responsibility on his image bearers and also means he wants us to participate in what he's doing here on earth and intends for us to do so, not as isolated individuals, but together. So these are the 3 kind of first steps into Shalom seeking. Being peacemakers who are looking to bind up brokenness in our world, not because we have the personality or we have the training or the specific gifts, but because we are empowered by the Holy Spirit to seek God's Shalom, to create God's flourishing right where we are. And we do that by choosing Hesed, by practicing Hesed. Proximity to pain, practical care of felt needs, and perseverance for the long haul. When George Floyd was murdered in our city, I looked around at various protests and prayer rallies, and I saw so many white peacemakers, so many white people who were stepping into this work for the very first time. and how they struggled with reckoning with the sin of racism in our country and the ways that it is flaring up all around us. And one of the things that I chose to do is I chose to be a peacemaker who chooses Hesed. Even though watching that video broke my heart and turned my stomach and inspired bitterness and fear and rage in me, I knew that our calling to reflect Jesus as our Prince of Peace is most needed in times of great strife and division. So I chose to get proximate to the pain of my white brothers and sisters and ask, where does it hurt? And I chose to get really practical with them and say, here's something you can read. Here's a prayer you can pray when you're feeling anxious and overwhelmed. And I chose to persevere for the long haul, telling them it's going to be hard, it's going to be long, but you're not in this alone. I will be right by your side. And in doing so, I believe that I got to see something that Dr. King talked about often during his life and ministry and work. He talked about the beloved community. Dr. King describes it this way: but the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opposers into friends. The type of love that I stress here is not eros, a sort of aesthetic and romantic love, not philia, a sort of reciprocal love between personal friends, but it is agape, which is understanding goodwill for all men. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. It is a love of God working in the lives of men. This is the love that may well be the salvation of our civilization. In his book, The Beloved Community, Charles Marsh goes on to flesh this out. And this sounds a lot like Hesed. He says, King's concept of love was surely not the platitudinous all you need is love. It was rather the passion to make human life and social existence a parable of God's love for the world. It was agape, the outrageous venture of loving the other without conditions, a risk and a costly sacrifice. One of the things that I have learned in studying God and walking alongside God is that God is consistent. And we start to see all these different words to just kind of grapple with what we're looking at. And what we're looking at is the remarkable, transcendent, transformative love of God, the Hesed of God, the agape of God. In this moment, peacemakers, I believe that it is our call to resist the division and violence of this moment, especially around racism, by becoming the beloved community who seeks shalom by practicing Hesed. And I'll close with this one last thought from Carolyn Custis James. She says, the gospel, even in its most primitive Old Testament form, has the power to rescue a believer from drowning in herself by moving her to think of someone else. And that is really what peacemaking is. It is thinking about how God thinks about us and saying, who am I to God? Does God love me with a steadfast, everlasting love? How do I love myself with that steadfast, everlasting love? And from that overflow, I get to think of someone else by loving them with a steadfast, everlasting love. And then as we become a community, a beloved community, we get to speak to the powers and hold the powers accountable for the ways that they have prevented people from feeling beloved, for the ways that they have undermined steadfast, everlasting love. So sound view and roots. I hope the next time you read Ruth, that you look for shalom, and that you see that Hesed is practiced in these two women before you ever get to Boaz. And I hope that you know that right where you are in your everyday, ordinary life, you are the peacemaker that your world needs. And it looks like you being proximate to pain, being practical to meet felt needs, and persevering for the long haul. Thanks for letting me share space with you. Have a blessed and beautiful week.